Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you all. I'm going to take the time I have with you to talk about a case that I think offers enormous lessons and insight to current movements taking place around the world today. And that's the South Korean impeachment struggle against President Park Geun-hye, which took place in 2016 and 17. So the movement began in October 2016 when it was revealed that the president's confidant was accused of receiving more than $700 million in bribes from some of South Korea's largest corporations. So the confidant also had what many people saw as a disturbing level of influence over the president. She was said to have had access to private, confidential, government documents. She edited the president's speeches, and she embezzled from the budget for the South Korean Winter Olympics. So when this information came out, the Korean population was outraged. Some of them demanded the president's immediate impeachment. But the leaders of the Democratic Party, which is Korea's main liberal party, made a decision to proceed carefully and deliberately. So they were aware of the optics of the situation. And they wanted to convey the message that they were defenders of the democratic order and not, quote, an invading mob that was bent on a palace coup, which is how one person put it. So instead of immediately demanding impeachment, they gave President Park a number of options that would allow her to exit the office gracefully with her dignity intact. So they suggested that she let opposition lawmakers appoint a prime minister who would serve as a de facto head of state. So even though President Park repeatedly apologized, she didn't really offer up any new information as to what had happened. And ultimately, she rejected offer after offer of compromise, which left both South Korean citizens and lawmakers with the conclusion that impeachment was the only option. So as all of this was going on, civil society groups launched a people power movement that asked people to come out in the streets and demand the president's resignation. So the first protest was relatively small, something like 30,000 people. But from there, the protests grew each week as Koreans became increasingly dissatisfied and angry at both the revelation and also the president's refusal to resign. So for 17 weeks in a row, that's 4 months, huge crowds that averaged more than 1 million people per demonstrations gathered in Seoul's City Hall Square in the freezing cold week after week. The protests were organized by a coalition of more than 1,500 civil society groups. So historically, these groups were pretty fractured. They didn't really cooperate much. But in this case, they were able to come together. They set rules for decision-making, and they agreed on unified demands. There were professors and labor union leaders and regular citizens from diverse fields that brought with them diverse experience in organizing and activism. So the leadership structure that they put in place was one of the most impressive aspects of this case, and I'd invite you to learn more about that. So decisions were made by the governing committee that met every week, and these decisions were then implemented by specially trained volunteers. So this meant that any given demonstration had more than 250 staff working at one time. These people were in charge of managing people and resources. They were making sure that no one got hurt, that violence didn't break out, that children didn't go missing. They wore special uniforms and handed out candles. They gave instructions, and they were generally in charge of making sure that order was maintained. They knew that the potential for violence was high. The atmosphere was politically charged, and the gatherings were so massive. So they took deliberate steps to stop violence from breaking out. So people were trained to identify people that might commit violence and marginalize them before they could cause trouble. So in one example, an artist named Lee Gang-hong distributed 200,000 flower stickers So when the police blocked the path of protesters covered police cars and buses with stickers to the point that the police cars and buses looked like beautiful flower-covered hills. So during the height of the protests, that was February 2017, the atmosphere was similar to Serbia in October of 2000 and the early days of Tahrir Square. People held candles, they performed plays, they sang folk songs. Well-known folk singers performed and created what was more similar to a concert-like atmosphere. Families held picnics and people brought their babies in strollers. At one point, 100 university professors gathered in central Seoul, and they called themselves Professors for Democracy. Also, the Korea Peasants League drove their tractors and other farming vehicles towards Seoul from various parts of the country to protest outside City Hall. And it took some of them more than 10 days to reach the capital. So this here is a piano protest, and that is the current president, Moon Jae-in, who was at the time a presidential candidate. So this nonviolent, sort of playful vibe turned the protests into these family-friendly gatherings, and they allowed for greater participation from all members of society, including women, children and young people, older folks, and also men. At this point, I'd like to show you a short video that conveys the sort of festive nature of the protests in spite of the serious demands that they had. So we can watch that. And yeah, please excuse some of the unfortunate captions. Can we play the video? Do we hear the audio? No. Thank you. So as you can see, the protests were incredibly diverse. And I think the diversity of the protests sent a strong message to both citizens and lawmakers, some of whom may have been on the fence at this point. The message was that the impeachment movement was mainstream, that the movement was acting in accordance with the principles of democracy and good governance, and that it was those who opposed them that were anti-democratic, radical, and marginalized, and on the fringe. So finally, after 17 weeks of protests, a parliamentary vote was held in which 8 out of 10 lawmakers voted to impeach President Park. The parliamentary decision was later upheld by the courts, and she's now in prison facing a 24-year sentence for 18 charges of corruption and abuse of power. So I think the South Korean case offers some important lessons for movements, and that's that if the public hadn't been engaged as they were in the numbers that we saw, we would not see this outcome. And by channeling their anger into a powerful political message, they pushed reluctant legislators to pass the impeachment motion. But ultimately, the movement did more than impeach the president. And it's that the struggle they carried out really brought about an environment of empowered citizens and also a new administration that is, for the most part, governing the country in accordance with the will of the population. So that's all I have about the South Korean case, and I invite you to seek out more material about it. There's a number of organizations that are, studying that case and that are offering lessons from it. There's also, the Albert Einstein Institute, as well as other organizations that offer an enormous amount of material online. So I'd invite you to check that out. Thank you so much.